A week and a half ago, there was this strange and fascinating report in the Wall Street Journal from national security reporter Shane Harris. That reporting was the first time we ever had any documentation, any confirmed reporting about any American citizen making an effort to get involved in the Russian attack on our presidential election last year. That Wall Street Journal scoop, again, about a week and a half ago, was about this wealthy Republican operative who had funded and who'd been involved in opposition research efforts and dirty tricks campaigns against Bill Clinton, all the way back in the 90s in Arkansas. What Shane Harris at the Wall Street Journal was able to report was that Republican operative, Peter Harris, at the end of last summer, he assembled a team to try to get in contact with, to try to get in cahoots with Russian hackers. Before Peter Smith died earlier this year at the age of 81, he freely admitted to the Wall Street Journal that he had surmised that these Russian hackers he was trying to get in touch with were probably linked to the Russian government. That didn't bother him. He thought the Russian government hackers attacking our election system might have been able to hack Hillary Clinton's emails. And so he formed this team late last summer to try to find the appropriate group of hackers, to try to make contact with them, to try to get Hillary Clinton's stolen emails off of them so those emails could be deployed against her in the campaign on behalf of Trump supporters. So it's really interesting bombshell reporting from Shane Harris, again, about a week and a half ago. It's a big advance in terms of what we understand about this story and what we as Americans understand about what happened to our country last year. I mean, it is now well established, or it is at least firmly attested to by multiple U.S. intelligence agencies, that the Russians did this attack last year, and it had a few different elements to it, right? And all of these elements of it we're getting more detail on all the time, but we've got the basics. It was a three-pronged attack, right? Russian government and military hackers first went after U.S. state and local election systems. They targeted voter registration rolls. We're still not exactly sure what they did with that information, but we do know that they tried it on in multiple states. That was one prong of the three-prong attack. Second prong was a sophisticated, intensive propaganda effort, largely using social media, but also using Russian state-controlled traditional media outlets like RT and Sputnik. Incidentally, there have been reports that U.S. investigators are also looking into whether or not American pro-Trump right-wing media outlets like Breitbart News might also have been part of that second prong of the Russian government attack. But those reports are as yet unconfirmed. But the third prong of this three-prong Russian attack on our country last year was straight-up hacking. The Russians hacked into American political organizations, notably including the Democratic National Committee and the Hillary Clinton campaign. They stole data from those sources, and then they strategically fed that information back into the United States to try to inflict maximum political damage on Hillary Clinton and, not incidentally, to help Donald Trump win the presidency. So we know about that three-pronged Russian attack, and that reporting from the Wall Street Journal a week and a half ago was a really significant advance to understanding what happened, because for the first time in that Wall Street Journal report, we had news that American citizens tried to participate in one prong of that Russian attack. American citizens tried to participate in the third prong, that hacking part. They tried to obtain some of the Hillary Clinton materials they believed the Russians had hacked and stolen because they wanted to use them for political effect on behalf of Donald Trump. Now, in addition to advancing the story in that way, advancing our understanding of what happened, there were two big specific revelations in that Wall Street Journal reporting that really brought that story to the doorstep of the White House. The first is that Peter Smith, this now deceased longtime Republican operative who admitted to the Wall Street Journal that he was running this project, that he was trying to work with the Russians, he claimed during those efforts that he was working with Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, who at the time of those efforts was a senior advisor to the Trump campaign. Now, Mike Flynn is not confirming whether or not that's true. He's not commenting on that reporting at all. But the other big specific revelation in that Shane Harris piece in the Wall Street Journal, which sort of corroborated or at least supported that claim about Flynn, is that in that same Wall Street Journal piece, Shane Harris also reported that U.S. investigators, quote, have examined reports from intelligence agencies that described Russian hackers discussing how to obtain emails from Hillary Clinton's server and then transmit them to Mike Flynn via an intermediary. So, I mean, that still doesn't mean for sure that Mike Flynn, then a senior advisor to the Trump campaign, it still doesn't mean that Mike Flynn for sure was in on this project to work with the Russians on their attack. I mean, we have reported that the guy running that project claimed he was working with Flynn. We have reporting quoting a number of people who were either involved in that project or who were approached to be involved in that project, saying that Peter Smith, the guy running it, told them that Flynn was part of it. We've got this report from the Wall Street Journal, about these intelligence reports about Russian hackers trying to get Clinton emails and trying to get them to Mike Flynn through an intermediary. So the statements by Peter Smith, the fact that he said those statements not just to the Wall Street Journal, but to multiple people at the time, these intelligence reports which describe something that sounds very much like that, I mean, none of that is proof that Mike Flynn was involved in it. But that's a lot of smoke burning around that specific question of whether or not a senior advisor to the Trump campaign was in on the Russian attack, right? There's strong suggestion here, but no proof. And one of the most remarkable elements of that reporting, which is so important now in retrospect, was that even though that suggestion about Mike Flynn being in on this thing was as red hot as you can possibly get, right? All that smoke, all that sort of circumstantial evidence that the Trump campaign's senior advisor was involved in the Russian attack, helping in the Russian attack, despite what a bombshell that would be if that were ever proven to be true. Mike Flynn has no comment on the matter. And the White House doesn't even try to say it didn't happen. Do you remember what the White House statement was in that Wall Street Journal report on whether or not Mike Flynn really did participate in that effort to get involved in the Russian attack? The White House statement on that to the Wall Street Journal was, quote, if Mike Flynn coordinated with this in any way, it would have been in his capacity as a private individual. So they're not denying it, right? They're saying, like, you know, in other words, yeah, sure, maybe we had a guy on the campaign who was working with the Russians on their attack. And sure, maybe we later made him national security advisor. But that whole thing where he was working with the Russians on their attack, that was like a hobby. That was like, you know, that was like a side project. That was his after school project. That was like something he did on his own. Nothing to do with us. So that Wall Street Journal report was not this past Thursday, but the Thursday before. The following night, so 2 Fridays ago, the night after that initial Wall Street Journal report, they moved the ball forward a little bit further. When in a second story, they reported that in addition to Mike Flynn, Peter Smith, this Republican operative running that operation to try to get involved in that Russian attack, to try to help the Russian attack, the Journal reported last Friday night that he also claimed to be in communication with, in coordination with, not just Flynn, but a number of other people who were senior campaign officials on the Trump campaign at the time and who are now senior officials in the Trump administration. He said that he was involved with, he was in communication with, he was in coordination with not just Flynn, but also Steve Bannon, Sam Clovis, Kellyanne Conway. So that was reporting on 2 subsequent nights from the Wall Street Journal. And all of that was incredibly dangerous reporting for the Trump campaign and the Trump administration, right? Evidence that there were Americans involved in trying to help Russia attack the United States. And that American effort was admittedly led by a Trump supporter who said at the time, who admitted openly, who bragged about the fact that he was working directly with the Trump campaign, right? At least he was working directly with Mike Flynn and these other folks. He was at least in communication and coordination with them to some extent, right? That is very dangerous stuff for the Trump campaign and obviously for the Trump administration. But as worried as the Trump folks must have been by that report, I think the comfort they could take was that there was no definitive proof that the Trump campaign was involved, right? maybe looks like there's a lot of suggestion that Flynn was involved. Certainly the guy running it said other Trump campaign people were involved, but that's not proof. All right, that reporting from the Wall Street Journal sort of crept right up to the water's edge, but it did not dip in a toe. That was the status of this story before this weekend. And then this weekend, cannonball. The New York Times reporting this weekend follows that initial Wall Street Journal report. It is now the second documented, confirmed report of Americans participating knowingly in the Russian effort to affect our election. This time, the incident occurs 2 months earlier than that effort convened by Republican operative Peter Smith that was reported in the Wall Street Journal. And this time, it is not someone who is acting as a Trump supporter. It's not somebody who is acting in, adjunct to the Trump campaign and in support of the Trump campaign. It's no longer someone who says he knows people and is maybe working with people on the Trump campaign. No, this time, it's the Trump campaign itself at the highest level. It's the president's campaign manager. It's his son-in-law and senior advisor. They're not denying they were in the room for this meeting. And his eldest son, his namesake, not only admits attending this meeting, he's explained explicitly that the reason he took the meeting, the whole reason he went, was because he thought he might be able to obtain some new dirt on Hillary Clinton from this Russian lawyer who was coming to Trump Tower for a meeting. Coming to Trump Tower for a meeting to talk about dirt on Hillary Clinton. Coming to Trump Tower on the recommendation of someone that Donald Trump Jr. knew from the time the Trump Organization put on the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow in a financial partnership with a Russian oligarch known to be close to Vladimir Putin. Now, meeting with a Russian person who you know, or in this case, meeting with a Russian person who you say you don't know, that's not a crime. I mean, it's a little weird for that to happen in the heat of a presidential campaign and for the meeting to involve the president's son, his son-in-law, and his campaign manager. They're all meeting with somebody they don't know from another country. I mean, it's weird, but it's not criminal. That said, it may actually be criminal if the stated and explicit purpose of that meeting is because they're aware that foreign nationals are trying to influence a U.S. election, and they explicitly, overtly take that meeting because they would like to help those foreign nationals in their goal of trying to influence our election in a way that will hurt Hillary Clinton and help Donald Trump. If you explicitly take a meeting with the express purpose of trying to help foreign nationals succeed in their attack on the United States, which you understand they are carrying out, if that's the case, then you admitting to taking that meeting, which Donald Trump Jr. has now done, that's a lot of things. But that is not a smart thing to admit to if you're trying to avoid potential criminal liability, say, in case these things are ever investigated or prosecuted, which I don't know, they might be, who can say? There have been a lot of surprises in the reporting on the Trump-Russia affair. This evening, it was, however, the least surprising news yet when we learned that Donald Trump Jr. has finally now hired a lawyer to help represent him in the investigations into the Russian attack on our election and the investigations into whether or not the Trump campaign or anybody associated with the campaign ever tried to help in that attack. So, yeah, now he's got a lawyer, now that he's explicitly admitted he took that meeting to try to help the Russian attack. So now, in the space of a week and a half, we have had two major stories, none of which are denied by any of the principals involved. The first two major stories about that Russian attack last year having American Confederates. And the first of those stories in the Wall Street Journal was about a Trump supporter who suggested he had links to the Trump campaign. The second story, broken this weekend by the New York Times, was that it was the Trump campaign. At which point, from a distance, it's this kind of a game over moment, right? At the beginning of the scandal, this is what everybody was wondering about. Might something like this have happened? Could something like this ever be proved? Is it really possible something like this could have happened? Now that it's upon us, though, it's interesting that they're really not denying that it happened. I mean, I think in both of these instances, both the Wall Street Journal story and the New York Times story, the reporting is so good that they can't really deny that it happened. Instead, their defense, I guess, has to be, yeah, it happened, but so what? I mean, with reporting this good, the Trump campaign defense, the White House defense, basically has to be that, yeah, this stuff happened, but there's nothing wrong with what they did. They're not embarrassed by it. This behavior is totally fine. All these meetings with Russians and contacts with Russians throughout the campaign, nothing to be embarrassed about. They're totally on the up and up. The problem with that as their defense is that if that were the case, you would expect them to have been totally upfront about all of their Russian meetings, all of their Russian contacts from the very beginning.
Are there any ties between Mr. Trump, you or your campaign, and Putin and his regime?
No, there are not. It's absurd, and there's no basis to it.
Did anyone involved in the Trump campaign have any contact with Russians trying to meddle with the election?
Absolutely not.
I'm asking you a direct question. Was there any contact in any way between Trump or his associates and the Kremlin or cutouts they had?
I joined this campaign in the summer, and I can tell you that all the contact by the Trump campaign and associates was with the American people.
Whether there were any contacts, sir, I'm just trying to get an answer.
Yeah, of course not. Why would there be any contacts?
I did not have communications with the Russians, and I'm unable to comment on it.
Did any advisor or anybody in the Trump campaign have any contact with the Russians who were trying to meddle in the election?
Oh, of course not.
Can you say whether you are aware that anyone who advised your campaign had contacts with Russia during the course of the election?
Well, I told you, General Flynn obviously was dealing, so that's one person, but he was dealing as he should have been.
During the election?
No, nobody that I know of.
Those conversations never happened. I hear people saying it like it's a fact on television. That is just not only inaccurate and false, but it's dangerous.
Does the president
and it does undermine our democracy.
What's that about undermining our democracy? This latest reporting about a Kremlin-linked lawyer meeting during the campaign with Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort. This is, on the one hand, just the latest in what is now an incredibly long string of meetings and contacts between people in the Trump campaign and Russian officials during the campaign and during the transition, meetings that were all denied, none of which were initially disclosed until the press figured them out one by one, and then, oh yeah, one by one, they've admitted to each of them one by one. Oh yeah, I forgot that one too. Oh yeah, I forgot that one too. But in addition to that, this new reporting really does include an explicit admission from the president's son, who was acting as a campaign official, that when the Trump campaign learned that Russians had launched a hacking attack against the United States to try to influence the outcome of our election, the Trump campaign response to that at the highest levels was, how can we get in on that? To see what the Trump campaign might be able to get out of that sweet, sweet foreign attack on the United States. At the beginning of this saga, there were so many mysteries, so many intriguing questions that we now have answers to. We now have answers to what were kind of the worst and most damning of those questions. We knew about the Russian attack. We knew the Trump campaign was denying any contacts with Russians. There was this interesting question as to whether or not it was possible that any American, let alone anybody connected to the Trump campaign, might have been aware of, let alone involved with, let alone supportive of that Russian attack. We've now got answers to those questions. And honestly, it is now, therefore, no longer a question of whether they did it. It's just a question of what's going to happen now that we know that, now that they are admitting it. And let me add this, just within the last couple of minutes, and we're going to have more on this in just a second, just in the last couple of minutes, the New York Times has published an addendum to this story. I'm just going to read you the lead of this, okay? Just to put the cherry on top of this. Before arranging a meeting with a Kremlin-connected Russian lawyer he believed would offer him compromising information about Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump Jr. was informed in an email that the material he was going to get about Hillary Clinton was part of a Russian government effort to aid his father's candidacy. The email to the younger Mr. Trump was sent by Rob Goldstone, who helped broker that June 2016 meeting. Mr. Goldstone's message, as described to the New York Times by 3 people, indicates explicitly that the Russian government was the source of the potentially damaging information. So ahead of that meeting, they knew it was the Russian government. Ahead of that meeting, the president's son, according to this new reporting, was informed, hey, the Russian government has dirt on Hillary Clinton. And apparently the response to that was, just broken tonight in the New York Times, just moments ago. Adam Schiff is the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. He joins us next for an extended interview tonight. Stay with us.